you very much, Tanya, for the kind introduction, and to Howard for having me here. Howard and I have dabbled in PME and other things over the years, and I was rather excited to see General Carignan here this morning. Unfortunately, she's gone, so I can't contribute to her advanced PME, becoming a student of or advancing her naval education. But there we are. She probably has people taking notes for her. This is a paper that I have been wanting to write for quite some time, and just never had the reason to do it. And well, mostly nobody was paying me to do it. Now that I'm retired, and Howard isn't exactly paying me, and he didn't drag me as far as from Singapore, but it's good to be here with you, and I'm really excited to have gotten into this. And with that, I want to emphasize that I'm nicely retired now, and I'm not feeling under any institutional constraints to toe any party lines. You're getting the unvarnished rich speak here. I don't know how much of my abstract you hoisted in when Tanya read it out, but if you get a chance to see it, it's worth looking at it again. But you should never start off with an apology. But I apologize that I didn't really follow the abstract. It's not an accurate reflection of what I'm going to speak on today, but still it serves the purpose of an introduction to the topic, and so I decided to leave it as is. You see, as I sat down to draft my remarks, a couple of seminal papers hit the streets that I want to bring to your attention as background to set the tone for my presentation. The first of these is the very topical paper by Professor Sarah Payne from the Naval War College. She must be the only member of the faculty who isn't here with us and Evan in person. But Her by Land or by Sea is out in the recent September-October edition of Foreign Affairs. It sparked my thinking on the dilemma that Canada shares with the United States because of our joint ownership of the top half of this continent. Are we continental powers or maritime powers? And that got me pondering also the gents most commonly identified as shaping Western strategic thought: Clausewitz, Jomini, Mahan, and Corbett. I presume you all will be familiar with their tenets, so I won't go into any detail of them here, although I will pursue it a little bit in the paper, the written paper. Other than I want to confess my opening premise is that none of them apply to the Canadian condition, other than to the extent to which they have been adhered to by Canada's imperial master of the day, for us to follow along with, those great powers being in succession France, Britain, and the United States. The second paper to which I will point which I'll point you as background is by Brian Santarpia, who retired from the RCN a couple of years ago as a Rear Admiral, his last appointment being Director General Plans on the Canadian Strategic Joint Staff. His paper, entitled Canada's Need for a Grand Strategy, was delivered to a Sea Power conference similar to this one in Calgary 2 months ago, at which several of the other participants here were at with me. And it's just appeared in the new edition of Starshell last week. The key point he makes that is central to my presentation is that Canada has had the luxury of never having had to develop a grand national security strategy, coming as we have under the protection of the aforementioned great powers. The comma, however, to that statement is that even within that protective context, Canada would have been better off to have put some governmental intellectual effort into working through what our grand strategy should have been, because Canada has always had its own economic and foreign policy interests that would have been better enabled by the capacity for direct application of our own independent naval and military force. I urge you to seek out Brian's paper, and I've quoted his conclusion on the slide for you to ponder through my presentation, the key point being his last sentence, which I'll read out in case it's too low on the slide for you to see. Only by cultivating a genuine strategic culture rooted in history, informed by debate, and expressed through maritime strength can the nation move from reacting to events towards shaping its destiny. To my presentation then. There are many definitions of strategy, and the one that I use is that it is a set of principles to guide the purpose of a force, in our case the fleet, from which is determined its employment and consequent force structure development. Spoiler alert, my conclusion is that in the case of Canada, in the absence of an overarching grand national strategy, naval professionals have had to divine the wishes of government, and being fallible humans, we often deferred to the biases of their own aspirations. And noting again at this point that none of the great strategic thinkers have really influenced the course of Canadian strategic thought, what follows is a tour over the centuries of the development of a Canadian naval strategy, or lack thereof. The first native-born Canadian practitioner of a naval strategy could be said to be Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville. Not advancing. Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville. His online biography describes him as a soldier and adventurer, which is instructive. But for our purposes, he's better known for a series of single-ship actions in his 500-ton, 50-gun ship Le Pélican, with which he terrorized the English colonies far and wide along the eastern seaboard and into the Caribbean, and in 4 expeditions over the decades 1686 to 1697, he effectively cleared the English fur traders from the Hudson's Bay, nearly shutting down the HBC as it was only just getting started. The soldier designation is apt because close study of his tactics reveal them to be a maritime adaptation of the irregular frontier form of warfare, styled as la petite guerre. Small units operating separately from the main force, using speed and maneuver in hit-and-run attacks to disrupt the enemy. There's a premonition there of La Jeune École that I haven't really thought through, so I'm not going to get into it here, but I just want to leave you with that there. And it may appear in the published paper. After d'Iberville's death in 1706, this colonial-level warfare was subsumed into the better-known struggle for mastery of the seas between the main French and British fleets for the next century, as recorded by Rear Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan in his Influence of Sea Power Upon History volumes. I don't need to repeat here the details of how the seesawing of alternating command of the oceans, the Atlantic Ocean in particular, impacted the changing of hands in North America through that century, culminating in the War of 1812. Easily lost in all of that, however, is the fact that as the land frontier between the British colonies, well, French and British, and then British colonies and the American states extended inland, quite a lot of the border was defined by the waters of the upper St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. In the War of 1812, after modest beginnings, both sides quickly built large warships to contest those inland seas. Commodore Perry famously winning control of Lake Erie in September 1813, which the Americans held for the rest of the war, although the more central theater of Lake Ontario remained undecided at war's end. It's in the ensuing peace that the continental impulse comes into play as a factor in Canadian naval thinking. For whereas the Rush-Bagot Agreement, limiting naval armaments on the Great Lakes, is held up as key to the so-called undefended border between Canada and the United States, the fact is that the Canadians never felt that the Royal Navy, even with their command of the high seas, could reliably reinforce the inland frontier quickly enough. Thus, Canadian defense planners came to hold the concept of a provincial marine of minor warships as essential to countering a renewed American invasion, to hold off the invaders until British Army reinforcements could arrive. This instinct became ingrained after Confederation in 1867 and the subsequent withdrawal of the British garrisons, coincident as that was with the post-Civil War Fenian raids across the lakes and the St. Lawrence. This all came to, or the need to do something about all this came together in the mid-1880s with the appointment of a retired Royal Naval Reserve officer named Andrew Gordon as head of the Fisheries Protection Service. Gordon had seen service with the RN in the Provincial Marine during the Fenian raids of 1866. And soon after assuming his appointment as head of the Fisheries Protection Service, he broadened his mandate to put together in 1888 the first truly Canadian-derived strategic assessment of the Dominion's naval defenses. For the time, and considering the rudimentary bureaucratic resources to hand, it's a rather amazing piece of staff work. In a well-argued 35-page document, he laid out a plan to reorganize the Fisheries Protection Service to serve as the nucleus of a naval militia. The cornerstone being acquisition of a pair of Rattlesnake-class torpedo gunboats that were small enough to navigate from the Atlantic, where they would be stationed, to navigate the St. Lawrence and Welland canals to reach the upper lakes in case of crisis. The scheme went nowhere at the time due to the need to put the money towards the building of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. You'll find a theme starting to build here, government money going elsewhere. But the institutional memory survived to see it realized with the purchase of a ship of that class, the Rattlesnake class, in 1904, commissioned as the Canadian Government Ship Canada, and proudly advertised as the nucleus of a Canadian naval militia. As I've written elsewhere, and that's chapter 1 in the exciting new book that Tanya mentioned, available for sale out in the hall. Cash only, please, because I don't do credit cards. But I digress. As I have written elsewhere, that ship is the rightful initiator of what would be established as the Canadian Naval Service on the 4th of May, 1910. Time does not permit going into how that scheme also went off the rails, other than to note that the origins of the RCN got caught up in the desire of Admiral Jackie Fisher, First Sea Lord of the British Admiralty, that the nascent Dominion navies in Canada and Australia be established as fleet units, composed of a dreadnought battlecruiser supported by a sizable force of protected cruisers and destroyers. The Australians indeed followed through on that, but the first head of our Navy, Rear Admiral Charles Kingsmill, was politically savvy enough to understand the desire of Liberal Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier that a Canadian service be constituted of smaller cruisers and destroyers optimized for coastal defense and not capable of deploying abroad on what Laurier called imperial adventures on the high seas. Of course, even the modified Canadian Fleet Unit did not come to pass, and the RCN did not make a significant contribution to the Great War at Sea. However, the notion of Dominion battlecruiser fleet units was resurrected by the post-war Jellicoe Commission of 1919 to 20. Once again, the Canadian Naval Staff, now under the command of Commodore Walter Hose, put together another superb bit of staff work in the form of a series of so-called occasional papers, arguing instead for the gradual buildup of a naval force more appropriate to local conditions that would have seen a 46-ship Navy in commission by 1934, well in time to make an effective contribution from the outset of the Second World War. Yet again, however, the scheme fell afoul of government retrenchment and then the Great Depression, and as we all know, the RCN in September 1939 consisted of only a half-dozen modern destroyers as its opening frontline force. But as the RCN grew in strength through the Second World War and gained in confidence as one of the larger contributing Allied fleets, the Canadian Naval Staff resolved that they would end this war on a much better establishment than the previous. The Naval Plans Division, spearheaded by a brilliant reservist named Geoffrey Todd, who amongst other credits was a pre-war Rhodes Scholar, insinuated themselves into the government's post-hostilities planning committee, perhaps the only ever truly grand strategic planning group this country has ever seen. Working with such Canadian bureaucratic luminaries as Lester Pearson, John Holmes, Hugh Morong, and S. Scott Reed, Todd embarked on what one scholar has termed the golden age of Canadian naval planning. In July 1943, he developed an appreciation of RCN ship requirements for the war against Japan and for the post-war Navy that laid the groundwork for a peacetime Canadian naval structure of a carrier task force on each coast, aligned with the foreign policy mantra of the functional principle by which Pearson and the others foresaw Canadian intervention in post-war crises being predicated on possession of a military force with global reach. Well, of course, this too did not see fruition, falling a victim of the post-war retrenchment preferred by the isolationist Mackenzie King government. When the new internationalist regime of Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent, Minister of External Affairs being Lester Pearson, when they came to power in late 1948 in time to take charge of the buildup of Cold War forces, The RCN moved into its new NATO role of anti-submarine warfare without a coherent plan, beyond the desire to maintain some semblance of a balanced fleet structure. Save the carrier. One RCN planning document of the period that stands out is a so-called Brock Report, named for its principal driver, Rear Admiral Geoffrey Vanstone Brock. It appeared in July 1961, recommending the modernization and expansion of the RCN into a three-ocean navy, mentioning the Arctic Ocean for the first time, the need for nuclear-powered attack submarines to patrol it, and the development of heliporter frigates, large enough to carry 8 to 10 large helicopters to deliver an embarked company-sized force of soldiers to a contested shore. Clearly developed in a reaction to the background chatter already permeating Canadian Forces headquarters about integration, it did not survive the test when Lester Pearson himself became Prime Minister in 1963 and made Paul Hellyer his Defense Minister. The logic of integration was for a Canadian variant of a US Marine Corps force structure. But under the step too far of unification, it instead became a cost-cutting exercise to fund the social programs of the growing Canadian welfare state. The chastened naval planners of what now is known as Maritime Command did manage an adaptation in the form of the task group concept. The notion that Canadian naval forces would deploy whenever possible as an identifiable national body instead of being split up and mixed into multinational task groups as was becoming the NATO fashion. This became the organizing principle for the Canadian Navy for the last 2 decades of the Cold War. And that, indeed, was the rationale for the force that Canada deployed to the Persian Gulf to join the coalition effort in response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990-91. That deployment came at an opportune time for the Canadian Navy, and indeed for the naval forces of most other nations, demonstrating as it did the continuing need for viable forces, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, to police the crises that would soon enough develop in the New World Order. Still, that need was not so obvious to governments seeking Cold War peace dividends, and the record of the 1990s can be chronicled by the search for a naval strategy to enable survival in this cost-cutting environment. The United States Navy was not exempt, and its From the Sea series became the guide for each of Britain, Australia, and Canada. In the Canadian case, it witnessed a series of documents, all sponsored by successive commanders of Maritime Command, seeking to find the right voice to respond to the sometimes confusing prescriptions coming out of the NDHQ policy staffs. This culminated with the development of Leadmark 2020, of which I have some personal part as the lead writer for the team, so beware of my biases. I could yak your ears off for a whole separate presentation on it, and that might be useful at some point, but not today. But I will hold to a couple of key points. The primary one is that, enabled by the newfound magic of email, early 90s, mid-90s, email, it was developed in loose coordination with allied staffs, specifically Britain, where Eric Grove was rewriting BR 1806 as the fundamentals of British strategy, or fundamentals of British maritime doctrine, and Australia, who had James Goldrick engaged in codifying Australian maritime doctrine. Secondly, our Leadmark drafts were seminared extensively with the Canadian academic community, some members still with us here today, in the process of which it was rigorously tested against historical experience and evolving concepts of medium power naval strategy, from the works of folks such as Richard Hill, Geoffrey Till, Eric Grove, and our own Peter Hayden. In the interest of time, I will put to you just a couple of key concepts from the document. Firstly, in adapting Grove's typology of navies, we placed Canada's in the rank 3 grouping, noting the USN was alone in the first rank and Britain and France as rank 2. Then, having identified 6 principles of a medium power naval strategy, we described Canadian variations on each of these. I don't have time to discuss them all in detail here, but I'll cycle through them, and most should be self-evident from the titles as I scroll through them. Amazingly, all that rigor paid off, as we were able to gain departmental approval for Admiral Greg Madison to publish it in June 2001, and to promulgate it widely. The only 3 terms, and I say only with asterisk, 3 terms that the policy shop had us remove prior to publication were specific references to amphibiosity, ballistic missile defense, and build in Canada. Although the concepts can be found woven between the lines, you don't have to look too hard, all of which have proven to be prescient, I would suggest, and worth a relook. As we all know, within a couple of months of publication in June 2001, along came the 9/11 attacks. And the Canadian response, drumroll please, rolled out precisely as prescribed. That was ignored in the post-operation analysis, the naval staff instead getting caught up in the moment that yet again everything had changed. And in 2005 there appeared Securing Canada's Ocean Frontiers. Although in truth, it mostly reaffirmed the principles of Leadmark with a nod to kick-starting an interest in the Arctic, which we have since sustained, and it has quite a good section on emerging naval missions. A term that became popular at about that time was reference to the last years of the Chrétien ministry as a decade of darkness, due to their underfunding of the military. I instead want to style the period after 2005 as the decade of churn. With the installation of General Rick Hillier as Chief of Defense Staff, in a throwback to a true understanding of integration, serious attention was given to concepts of jointness. And they weren't all jarmy. One especially interesting notion being his big honking ship, aka amphibiosity. Alas, all of that was lost in the need for retrenchment, once again, to resolve the 2008 financial crisis and the focus on Afghanistan. So successive admirals then embarked on a replay of the 1990s quest for a new and inspiring document with the right voice to rise above the churn and garner departmental buy-in to sustain fleet renewal. Alas, neither of Horizon 2050 nor its near cousin, Leadmark 2050, achieved departmental sign-off or public release. And meanwhile, the paying off of all the Iroquois-class command destroyers, as well as both tankers, meant the hollowing out of the task group concept. That brings us to the latest attempt, entitled Trident, posted internally in December 2023, of which I expect we'll hear more from its sponsor, Rear Admiral Jason Armstrong, who will address us later today. And having nearly run out of time, I won't go into it, but rather put to you that with all of the significant changes wrought over the last year, with the collapse of the rules-based order and threats to interoperability that were foundational to Leadmark 2020 and its successors, but with the impressive potential of rebuilding a fleet yet again capable of task group operations, it really is time for a new look at the whole issue and not just to find voice. To conclude, I accept the notion that strategizing is by nature a futures business. But especially in Canada, we don't spend enough time reviewing past efforts. And when we do, we typically fail to ask the fundamental question. Well, how did that work out? Or if we do, it's too often with just a cursory glance and each new look little more than the new admiral wanting a new strategy to call his own, quickly dismissing past efforts with, by inference, an unsat grade. Let's end by returning to the advice of Rear Admiral Santarpia, that even if we remain unburdened with a grand national strategy, we could at least return to base principles in the formulation of a Canadian naval strategy, work our butts off to engage government as a whole into becoming part of the development of a truly grand national strategy, connecting our ideals to our interests and our ambitions to our means. And with that, here's what my real conclusion is. Here's hoping that my survey today of the historic roots of our national strategizing and naval strategizing can help to inform that very needed debate. Thank you very much.